many people in the Conservative Party don't believe that trans people exist, and they think that they're confused kids, and they think that trans people are confused adults. I know what it's like to have something unprovable about me that's innate, that people told me growing up was a choice. I knew it wasn't. I don't understand why we can't apply the same grace to trans people. I don't think the idea of using fear of the other in politics to gain power, votes, influence is anything new, and it's just that trans people right now are an easy target for that.
We've got an upcoming election.
Can you believe it?
Are you excited?
I mean, I don't know if excited's the right word. I feel, if anything, maybe a little apprehensive. I don't think it's going to go my way.
What is your way?
Progressive. I feel like the options in front of us on the table are, it's like a shit sandwich A or shit sandwich B right now. But I still have hope. I think we can send a message.
Do you think that perhaps there is too much apathy amongst voters heading into this election? Like, do you think that perhaps there's an argument that maybe we should still be pushing for people to go and vote in the first place, or perhaps people to vote for the lesser of two evils?
100%. I mean, that's why I launched this campaign today. I think it's a real problem. I saw a statistic this week that only 40% of eligible young voters in the UK are planning to vote, which is just really disheartening. And, you know, that's where the progressive politics are. We need all of those votes. If we're ever going to see an end to like Tory and Tory light.
Tory light, that's important.
Tory light.
I mean, what do you mean by Tory light? Are you talking about Labour?
Yeah, absolutely. I just feel like everything that I loved about the Labour Party has been watered down over the last year or so. It's just every single thing I thought that the party stood for has been chipped away at.
A lot of queer people this election are feeling very disillusioned and very kind of upset, actually, and quite scared. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think partially because we're seeing trans rights used as a political football between both parties, and it feels like the days are gone when parties unequivocally stood for LGBT rights. It's very hard to know where Labour stands on those issues, although it's very clear where the Conservatives stand. You know, we saw Wes Streeting a couple of weeks ago saying he welcomed the Tory ban on puberty blockers. So it's like, that's a gay man in the Labour Party. Like, where do we find a home now? I also don't think that LGBT issues should be the main reason. I don't think LGBT issues should be your main focus when it comes to going to the polls. It's certainly not mine, but it is hard to vote for someone who isn't saying, I stand with you.
Because it's intersectional, right?
Absolutely.
So it's also to do with working hours and, you know, fair pay, which perhaps we're not seeing under the Conservative government. Yeah,
and you know, even I hope that Labour will really start to impress me with some progressive policies. But as it stands, I don't feel like they're particularly standing up for the working class anymore either. It's not like they're proposing anything that's dramatically reformist that I can get behind and maybe swallow a few of their MPs' comments that I don't agree with. It feels like it's a broad slate of policies that I don't really agree with anymore.
What kind of progressive policies would you like to see from them?
Nationalizing the water network, for example, committing to avoid privatizing the NHS. I think, you know, those are just two immediate examples that I just feel like those are such obvious wins for the Labour Party, it seems to me. And I don't understand why they've kind of turned their back on those left-wing ideas.
Because I suppose that's when it sort of delves into the intersectional, because we talk about reforming the NHS. I mean, actually, Labour do have quite a progressive policy on mental health, and they do want to bring in a mental health advisor into every school up and down the country, which is what they've promised to do. If you are a young person and you're experiencing, say, gender dysphoria, or, you know, you've got questions about your sexuality, I mean, would that not be the party that you should sort of gear yourself towards, because they're offering you potentially some support? Yeah,
possibly. I guess I think whatever I do at this general election, I think Labour are going to win. So I think it's important to also consider your options about whether or not you can, you know, potentially send a message to the Labour Party through voting for a more progressive candidate, if that exists in your constituency. and potentially help them understand that those voices are there and need to be listened to as well.
I feel that a lot of politicians often forget, particularly like queer voices, they forget the power that they hold when they are united. But at the moment, we're seeing a lot of broken up aspects of the community. You know, you've got things like the LGBT Alliance finding sort of new ground within Parliament and whatnot. What do you kind of make of that?
Do you mean the queer community being
Sort of broken up and divided at the moment?
I guess I kind of reject that narrative. I think that these are fringe people with fringe ideas. I don't think the LGBT Alliance represents queer people. I'm not even sure how many of them are gay. Like, it would not surprise me if that was being run by a bunch of straight men with sock puppet accounts. I think, yes, there are TERFs who are lesbians, but the most supportive people of trans people are lesbians per capita, if you will. So I kind of reject that idea. I think by and large, the queer community is pretty aligned about where we stand, at least when it comes to the rights of our community.
But I guess the queer community doesn't vote as a monolith, does it? And I mean, it finds homes in actually both of the major parties.
Sadly.
Well, you say sadly. Something that I've always found interesting as like a gay man myself is some of the politicians that push hardest for queer issues are actually some of the straight women in the Conservative Party. You've got Caroline Noakes, Alicia Kearns, both have fought for years for an inclusive conversion therapy ban, actually more than a lot of Labour MPs, some of whom may or may not be gay, etc. What do you make of that? Like, what's your reaction?
Well, I think it's fair, and it's just, as you say, like, I don't put queer issues at the forefront of my mind when it comes to my voting. It's a part of the picture. I mean, Theresa May had a great intent to reform the gender
Recognition Act.
Yes, exactly, the Gender Recognition Act, and I mean, that all got scuppered, but, like, you know, she understood something that I think the rest of the party doesn't. So I'm not going to turn down an ally wherever it's found. And I'm not saying that all conservatives are bad people. I know lots of them. They're good people. We disagree on things. I do find that I can't imagine aligning myself with the really extreme far right stuff that's coming out of the Conservative Party right now and seems to be the driving force within the party.
Why?
And I think if I found myself as a queer person being represented by those people, I would have to, I don't know how I would be looking at myself in the mirror every day.
You find that rhetoric dangerous?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's scary. I think Kemi Badenoch, everything that she's saying about trans people is really scary and really dangerous and is going to do a lot of harm. And it's particularly geared to create fear, create division, and to try and get fear votes, which is just such an ugly political tactic.
But that's interesting because she's doing it, she says, under the guise of protecting women.
That's what they always say. You know, women aren't in danger from trans people. Women are in danger from men or from violent men. And I'd love to see policies that address that. Let's fund more domestic abuse shelters rather than spending energy trying to police what genitalia is in which bathroom.
This is where it gets tricky, doesn't it? And this is where the national conversation has really honed in on and focused, is on domestic abuse shelters. Every right that a trans person might have or should be eligible for has been, well, they would like to take it away under the guise of, well, what happens if a man shows up at a domestic abuse shelter?
The fact is that right now, the Equalities Act allows for exclusions. You can exclude trans people from, for example, domestic abuse shelters if it's proportionate. That's already allowed. And so basically, Kemi is trying to fix an issue that doesn't exist because this issue is already solved for within the Equalities Act. You know, you can't turn up in a wig, call yourself a woman, and get into a domestic abuse shelter. That's not how it works. It's obviously case-by-case basis, and no one is advocating for that.
Well, also, it takes years to go through the gender recognition process, and that's something that I think often gets overlooked in this discussion, is it's sort of portrayed that you can just show up somewhere and decide that day, I'm now a woman, and I can take advantage of whatever women may have that I do not. But actually, that's not the case.
No. It's so hard to get a gender recognition certificate. But even so, like, you don't need that to necessarily access care as a trans woman. But the idea that people are cosplaying as women in order to hurt women, they don't need to do that to hurt women. There's so many other easier ways to go about abusing women if that's what you wanted to do.
Absolutely.
Staying on Kemi, we've seen a lot from Kemi over the last couple of years, especially once she stepped into the Equalities Office, you know, when it comes to LGBT issues. What's your just reaction to sort of some of the stuff she's put out there? We've had the single sex based comments, we've had stuff about trans children.
I wish she'd just go out and actually meet some trans people and talk to them and understand what their life has been like and what their experiences are. I think with a lot of these notable transphobes, I think they're coming from a place of, they're starting from a place where they don't believe that trans people exist. And so therefore everything that they do is justifiable. But trans people do exist. I know lots of them. And if trans people exist, so do trans children. It's common sense. And I know what it's like to have something unprovable about me that's innate, that people told me growing up was a choice. I knew it wasn't. I don't understand why we can't apply the same grace to trans people.
A lot of these talking points, I feel, have been kind of imported from America in some ways. So things like the pedophilia narrative, things like the drag being a threat to people. And we've kind of seen them take hold in a lesser way in the UK that's become now actually prominent in politics more so than in society, I would say. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's scary. It's dangerous. I've been on the sharp end of it. You know, I've experienced the Daily Mail hit pieces calling me a danger to children. I've experienced it from Lawrence Fox implying that I'm a danger to children, or saying it outright. So I think it's the kind of rhetoric that's, as you say, it's just become a little bit more normalized over the last couple of years. And that's really grim. That's really grim that's kind of become something that we think is acceptable in society. I think it's only a matter of time until someone gets hurt because of it. You know, we've seen some pretty crazy protests outside of drag story times here in the UK. And it's much worse in the US, but I don't feel safe like I used to.
Do you have hope that that could change with a new government?
I guess it depends how staunchly they want to defend queer people's rights. And I think that they've been a little bit wishy-washy. I mean, Keir doesn't seem to know where he stands on the issue. I don't know. I'm not even convinced that it's a top-down issue that the government can fix. I think that the genie's out of the bottle in a lot of ways, and I think that the far right will find ways to kind of spread that narrative regardless of who's in power.
But it's interesting that it's the far right, because it was the far right who was gathered outside drag story times.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's difficult. What do you think incentivized them to turn up? I mean, that's an awful way of phrasing it, but it seems so bizarre that that's sort of like the Venn diagram of the far right.
Like that's where they've decided we need to show up. Yeah.
Well, I guess they're just reactive to anything that feels new or different to how life was when they were growing up, and that seems to be the motivating factor behind everything the far right does. But
wasn't that going on when they were growing up?
Well, I don't know. It wasn't done as visibly.
Right.
You know, we didn't. Although here in the UK there were lots of really prominent drag queens, and they were entertaining children in pantos, I think, as far as anyone can remember. So
but
it is a bit bizarre.
But was a national treasure.
Yeah.
You know, we pretty much had a state funeral for him.
Yeah. It is bizarre. I guess the rise in the visibility of trans people and the acceptance of trans people has, I think, naturally resulted in a pushback.
No, merited is an interesting word.
Yeah, no, it doesn't merit it.
But they think it does.
Yes.
So yeah, totally odd. But then
they're just shouting, you know, they're just the old man shouting at the sky gif.
But it's spurred on by right-wing figures in the Conservative government. And I guess that's what you're getting at about this import potentially from America, is this sort of evangelism that is being imported into the Conservatives. I mean, we saw just a couple of months ago, a number of Conservative MPs shared a stage with figures like Viktor Orban at the National Conservative Conference. And they were talking about, we need to get the country back to the nuclear family and having babies. I mean, is that something that you think is being imported from America? And do you think it's going to stick?
I think it's been recognized globally as an issue that will get traction. I don't think anyone really cares or believes about it, but they see it as an opportunity to mobilize people, to make people angry. Trans people are less than 1% of the population, like something like 0.1% of the population. It's a non-issue that affects very few people's lives. Trans people aren't coming for your kids, and no one's going to trans your children. It's just complete nonsense. But I don't think the idea of using fear of the other in politics to gain power, votes, influence is anything new, and it's just that trans people right now are an easy target for that.
I guess it fell flat, though. It has fallen quite flat during this election campaign.
It has, thankfully.
Because about 6 months ago, it was Lee Anderson, who's now was a Conservative MP, is now a Reform Party MP. He was looking ahead to the upcoming election. He said, well, this is going to be fought on culture issues. This is going to be the election of the culture war. And actually, we haven't seen that barely at all. I think Suella is sniping from the sidelines, but it has just fallen flat.
Yeah, which is nice. I mean, I think everyone in this country is experiencing such a difficulty in terms of cost of living and their money that I think that's become, the main thing people want to hear about. And I think they recognize that everything else is a bit of a distraction. But of course, you're still going to have Nigel Farage on a pier in Clacton asking what a woman is.
Well, we saw that question is actually such as someone that's been in media for a minute, is almost triggering at this point, because it's everywhere when you work in media, at one point last year especially. And I think it's something that seems to have subsided a little bit now, but is instead being replaced with these other things we've been discussing. But it's all kind of the same form, right? Because even when you look back to the 80s, the AIDS epidemic, everything we're discussing, you could just apply to gay men back then.
Absolutely.
It's just repeating itself in a new form. But like back then, that's now faded in most ways in society. But we're now seeing this, and in some ways what you're getting at is that it's fading in the election campaign. But something I would ask you is, do you ever feel like it did take hold in society among sort of the average person?
Which, the transphobia?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's so hard to tell because Twitter gives you one impression, and it's, a microcosm of horrible people. But then my own community is a microcosm of lovely people who really support trans rights. So I feel like I have very bad perspective on what the actual pulse is. The newspapers have it seems, very transphobic agenda. Is that reflected in the people who read the newspapers? I don't know.
Something that we were talking about earlier today, social media. I feel like certainly in queer world, someone that's active there, social media has become this place where people just sort of shout into the void. Be that, like you mentioned on Twitter, that might be anti-trans people. On Instagram, that might be people who are very embracing of everyone, right? We see two ends of the spectrum. But social media has unequivocally changed the way these discussions are had, because now you can talk to someone on the other side of the world about a really extreme view that no one in your life may share, but it makes you feel that it's everywhere. What's your sort of reaction to how social media has impacted the way that we discuss these kinds of issues?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's just as I was saying, it's very hard to know whether or not you're responding to a general sentiment that is shared by many people, or you're responding to one deliberately provocative troll. I think that so much of the queer liberation that we've experienced over the last decade is down to social media. I think it's been very helpful to see other types of people and to see them living normal lives. It's the same as when gay marriage was on the ballot in the US. You were much more likely to support it if you knew a gay person. I think social media gives you a way to know queer people in a way that you might not otherwise. This isn't really related to your topic, but I've been really moved by, the Queers for Palestine movement, which has kind of created this lovely cross-section of people who believe in Palestinian liberation, and they're potentially communities that wouldn't have necessarily overlapped before. And I think it's a great way of spreading understanding for both, between both communities. It's really special. It reminds me, that movie Pride with gays and lesbians support the minors. It's that similar sort of feeling of, not necessarily immediately obvious allies, but once you see them together, it makes perfect sense.
The Palestinian movement, how did those two communities actually come together? What do you think is the driving force behind that?
I think there's a lot of really fab, really radical, really politically engaged queer people who have been shouting about Palestine for a really long time. And I think it's natural that those communities are involved. Queer politics has always involved, at least on the left end, an anti-capitalist bent, an anti-cop bent, a free Palestine bent. So, it makes perfect sense.
And why is that? Why do you think, why do the queer community gravitate to, on the left end, why do they gravitate towards anti-capitalism?
I think we understand what it's like to be under the boot heel of something. So it makes sense for us to support other people who are experiencing that. Capitalism is the biggest boot of all.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you think there's a sense as well that you said that the queer community are good campaigners? And is that anything to do with, do you think that perhaps people feel that their bodies have been politicized and perhaps they're used to sort of fighting?
Yeah, I think once you've been through your own kind of crucible of, exactly as you say, being politicized, recognizing that your entire being is political to some people, it only makes sense for you to then extend your grace and your knowledge to other communities who are experiencing the same thing.
There was this thing I actually saw that said, it was a post from a gay person that said, I hope that people never have to experience this feeling every election that your rights are on the line. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at is I think queer people don't have the luxury during elections or during times of turbulence and change to just know that their rights are safe. And I think that's kind of maybe, again, not to put words in your mouth, but that's kind of what you're getting at with the Palestinian situation, is they're now in a position where they don't have control, Yeah,
absolutely. But as I say, it's been really I've had so many amazing DMs from Muslim people, Palestinian people. I can only take them at their word that that's where they're coming from. But, straight people in that part of the world who are just appreciative of the support that they're getting from queer people. And, as explicit as I didn't necessarily understand anything about the queer community before the struggle for Palestinian liberation really kicked off in the last year. And I've seen so much of it now, and it's really opened my eyes to the brilliance of that community.
I guess this is where I get not confused, but I question what you said about you shouldn't vote on LGBT rights, because as Connor was saying there, this is an election where actually people's rights are on the line.
Yeah.
Particularly, so we've just had the Labour manifesto today. Within that Labour manifesto, they've printed that they are going to ban conversion therapy, which is a huge divergence away from the Conservative Party, who, despite pledging that they would do, I think,
since 2018,
2018. Yeah, they have reneged on that promise. So, okay, let's start with, what do you think about conversion therapy? Should it be banned?
Absolutely. I think the idea of trying to change something innate about someone is monstrous. So it's just a no question to me. And I don't understand why it's such a difficult thing for a government to do.
Well, that's ruined my follow-up question.
Well, I know why it's difficult for them to do. It's because many people in the Conservative Party don't believe that trans people exist, and they think that they're confused kids, and they think that trans people are confused adults, and so they, the idea behind banning conversion therapy will prevent them from trying to talk trans people out of existing.
Well, what you've just touched on is something that so when I've been covering this over the years from a queer lens, I've always found that MPs, experts, whoever it might be, don't seem to understand that there's a big difference between conversion therapy and talks about gender. Mm-hmm. And I think that seems to be the line people are getting lost on is, oh, well, if we ban conversion therapy, suddenly we can't talk to someone about if they're experiencing issues with their gender and their identity, which actually is not two of the same thing. They're two completely separate issues. And we've now had 6 years of the Conservative government promising a ban. And I say 6, I would actually argue it's 4 or 5, because to be fair, the last year or two, let's be real, they haven't really been throwing out the promise as much. They've kind of shied away from it. And then, you hear these back alley things like, oh, they've dropped the ban. Then there's this paper that's on Rishi Sunak's desk ready to be signed, which we're yet to see.
It's definitely a more small C Conservative policy. I think it's like very sort of 2010, David Cameron, that kind of Conservative. I mean, particularly as well because the Conservative Party is a broad church that is very welcoming to the community. There are many of you lot in there, and I know because I've been to Conservative conference more times than I would like to mention. But it does welcome people from that community. And what's sad to me is the number of MPs, whenever Kemi Badenoch is doing one of these sort of speeches in Parliament, saying things like, no one is born in the wrong body. There are MPs who have to come out and explain that this is what you did to me in the 80s. This is why I joined a political party, because you promised me we wouldn't do this again. I guess it kind of speaks to that it's a fringe movement, maybe.
Yeah, a fringe movement that's got control. It feels.
That's interesting. Do you think that they are in control?
I mean, it seems that way from, the way the rhetoric that's coming out of Rishi Sunak and Kemi, like that, it feels like that's the party line right now. But I've always looked askance at the idea of conservatism being welcoming of queer people, because I think that they've always been the worst on our rights, and they've always played catch up. And I've never understood it when queer people can find a home there. I mean, if we're just talking, I guess ideally, government wouldn't have a lot of opinion on what people do or how they are, and they'd be there to make sure that water came out of our taps and that the lights were on. And then we could all just agree that we could find our home in any party, and we were just disagreeing on fiscal policy. But that isn't how it feels.
So the party, the Conservatives are too involved in us socially and not enough. Industry. What
I suppose it feels like whenever you hear someone talk about these issues, and as I say, trans people less than 1% of the population, it's like, this is not a serious issue. You are talking about something that doesn't matter to so many people and does matter so much to such a small number of people. I can't imagine why this is a priority for you.
It doesn't feel like a serious conversation.
The thing that I've always found, like as sort of like a reporter in the queer media scene, that's interesting when you talk to sort of LGBT conservatives, is that they'll often say, we brought in same-sex marriage, we got PrEP rolled out on the NHS, but they'll sort of negate to mention the sort of underneath layer, which is, for example, using PrEP. That was a long, hard-fought battle that involved a lot of pressure from places like Terence Higgins Trust, National AIDS Trust, activists and so forth.
Oh no, but tell them, because they won't know.
Well, no, it's interesting because when you do, in my experience, I don't want to speak fully, because obviously this won't always be the case, but I remember, let me just use an example. I once did a report on PrEP, and my quote tweets on Twitter were filled with LGBT conservatives criticising me for not, in this post, praising the Tories for rolling PrEP out on the NHS, which was one, ironic to me because it wasn't anything to do with it being rolled out. It was just a post about PrEP. And secondly, so I was like, okay. Secondly, it was interesting because they weren't mentioning, as I say, the layers to that discussion, which isn't just that someone woke up one day and said, let's roll out PrEP and it was done. It was many years and a lot of fighting. And this is obviously taking a bit of a detour. But my point being, Crystal, to you, what I would ask is, what do you say to those kinds of people who would say, well, hang on, my party, the Conservative Party, brought in these great things, which unequivocally have done great things for the community. PrEP has resulted in 2030 being a realistic goal to end new cases of HIV. But again, when you look at that underneath layer, what would sort of you say?
I think it's just to echo what you've said, which is the Conservatives have had to be forced to do anything that supports our rights, and they're not going to hand it to us unless we fight tooth and nail for it. And as soon as it's politically expedient for them, they'll drop us. So it feels conditional. And it's starting to feel conditional from the Labour Party as well.
Can I actually just ask you something based on that? You said you feel that they'll drop us when the time becomes right. Do you feel that they have dropped the community?
I know I keep saying that, trans issues are not, are such a small issue that affects such a small number of people, but it is the battleground right now for queer liberation. We've achieved so much, and trans people still need our help. And so when I see that part of the community being singled out and exploited for votes and demonized, yes, it's hard to feel like they're representative of the queer community at all.
That's one thing that the sort of worker solidarity movement always got. Sorry. It's for PoliticsJOE, okay? I'm going to talk about the unions.
Oh gosh, yeah, who could have seen that coming, Ava? Yeah, okay. No, I'm really kidding.
They did get that quite early on, early on, like the fight for women. They were saying, there were a lot of men who put their jobs on the line to say, well, if she's not coming, I'm not going. And
would you like to see that from sort of the equivalent in the world, which would be straight people? Sort of refusing to maybe do certain things unless these parties stood up for queer people.
Absolutely. And I know I said I don't put necessarily queer issues at the forefront of my mind when I'm voting. That's not to say that straight people shouldn't, That's kind of like my prerogative as a member of the queer community, I think, to say, okay, I'm going to put myself to one side and think about everyone else's issues. I think straight people's job is to put some of their stuff aside and think about what they can do for other communities.
It's because she's putting new oil and gas licenses at the front of her voting. That's what...
More fracking.
Okay, RuPaul. No, I'm only kidding. So when we last spoke in January, it was the day after you had the ruling in favour of you, that you had been libelled by a certain person who falsely, and we can say that legally, falsely accused you of paedophilia on social media in 2020, alongside a former trustee of Stonewall. It's been a few months. How are you feeling now?
Fabulous. Wondering when the check's going to clear?
There was a word that you used, and I'm not going to try and say it was a German word.
Schadenfreude.
Can you talk us through that word?
I think that, if I understand correctly, it's taking joy in someone else's suffering. I'm not going to say I've been reveling in his unraveling and decline over the last year, but there has been a small part of me that's taken a bit of satisfaction in it. It's been crazy. To be honest with you, considering how much time I spent thinking about Lawrence Fox over those 3 years before we got our judgment, it's amazing how little I think about him now. It's so nice. I never have to look at his Twitter feed. I never have to see what he said, if he said something about me. And it just feels like he's just gone into like a little corner of my mind where I put him because I won.
Something that I think a lot of gay people particularly resonated with is that slur has quite a dark meaning behind it that goes beyond what it actually is. Can you maybe talk to why it's so toxic, especially when used against members of the queer community?
Yeah, well, it's just a trope as old as the hills. Calling gay men a danger to children is nothing new. And he said it about me specifically because he knew it would be the most damaging thing he could say. It's a horrible accusation, and he knew what he was doing, and he was trying to destroy me with it. Since he's done it, it's been, as we were talking about earlier, it's been so much more normalized. And I get called a groomer on Twitter. Oh my, like more times than I can count now. If I write a piece for Metro, the comments under that are just going to be calling me freak, nonce, disgusting, veto, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, I think, all quite new over the last few years. And a lot of people have been emboldened by people like Lawrence Fox, who kind of blazed a path of bigotry. So yeah, it was very important to take a stand against it. I don't think that me winning against him is going to do anything about like the hordes that he has unleashed, but I think symbolically it was really important, and personally it was really important for me to stand up for myself.
What do you, there's a lot of people online, as you've just touched on, that throw these kind of things around, and unfortunately we're not in a position where all those people can be either identified or punished, if you want to use that word, as sued, whatever it might be. What do you hope people do take away from the ruling that you won?
Well, that if someone does it and they've got their name attached and they got a lot of followers, you can take them down. We might not be able to stop the faceless trolls, but we can stop the big people, the big outlets, from doing it. And I think that is really powerful, because it sets, it draws a line in the sand of where acceptable debate is. And I mean, I don't think we should have needed a reminder that pedophilia was on the wrong side of that line, but apparently he did.
This sets a precedent.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the precedent was already set. Terrorist and pedophile are two of the worst things you can say about someone in terms of defamation. They're like the examples that you give when you say, like, what are the worst things you could say to someone in terms of defamation? So he shouldn't have needed that reminder. But yes, the precedent has been reset. It is a reminder for everyone. And I think it is also important now, there's been a few defamation cases that have happened on Twitter specifically now. And, historically it was the province of, suing a newspaper that's printed something. It's very clear now that if someone with a huge following says something about you on Twitter, that's just as bad.
What do you think it means for drag performers? Because I think drag performers have been subjected so much over the last few years, and especially with the rise of Drag Race and that becoming mainstream and or mainstream, should I say. What does it mean for you to have this victory, just for, aside from even LGBT people, just for actually your community of fellow queens, kings and other performers?
Yeah, again, I would just say that it feels really great. It feels like we took back a little bit of ground and created a little bit of safe space for ourselves. I don't want to go much farther than that, really, because I think that, when it comes to my physical safety in and around the streets, this actually doesn't do anything for that, sadly. And that's still a present reality, but we'll take our victories where we can.
Should we do Vote Babes?
Let's do Vote Babes.
Vote Babes.
Vote Babes.
Vote Babes.
Yeah, I feel like we didn't do the comma there. Vote Babes.
Sorry.
Honestly.
Do you see how rude he is?
It was an intentional, double meaning.
Yeah.
I'm a babe who votes.
Okay, so Vote Babes.
Vote Babes.
Okay.
Vote Babes.
The sass. Why was it important to give it such a sort of fun, campy name?
Well, I wanted to actually use a different B word, but I thought it wouldn't get me on as much media.
Ooh, that would have been quite hot, actually.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
You would have had a safe space here regardless, but...
Can I tell you something embarrassing? I was actually really struggling to come up with a name for it, and I asked ChatGPT. ChatGPT gave us bitch vote.
Really? Really?
I mean, the robots are our new masters. There's nothing we can do about it.
That's quite hot, isn't it?
It is really good.
But I'm swayed so easy that now I'm pro AI.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm just a little bit in shock, Crystal, that you, as an iconic drag performer, couldn't come up with bitch vote.
I know.
Not to read you, but there it is.
I know. Was this a safe space to admit that?
It was at first. Now I'm less sure.
Funny to imagine you sitting at home on Windows 97 trying to work ChatGPT. What?
Which button is it now?
Yeah.
But seriously, why is this campaign so important to you?
Well, as I said earlier, this research came out in the last few days that says that only 40% of young people in the UK are intending to vote. It was really disheartening. I was talking to one of my friends about it, and it was actually Tia Coffey, who ended up not being able to be part of the campaign, but she's like, we should do something. We should do something and join forces. This was Friday night, so less than a week ago. Saturday morning, I thought, you know what, let's go for it.
It's a quick turnaround.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was that fast.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And you got 20 other. Yeah.
So Saturday morning, I call a photographer. I say, I think I might do this thing with like a couple of queens. He's like, well, get more than a couple. Like, see how many people you can get. And so then I just messaged every single person who's ever been on Drag Race in the UK. I'm going to do this thing on Monday. Do you want to be part of it? And a bunch of people said yes, but I can only do Tuesday. So we ended up doing it over 2 days. It ended up like ballooning and ballooning and ballooning. And yeah, it's been amazing. We had such a good response. So many people donated their time to it. I think I counted it all up. Combined, the artists involved have over 3 million Instagram followers. So it's got huge reach potential.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's like 5% of the UK.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. So I think it's got a real opportunity to like hopefully get a few people registered to vote.
Is that the impetus? It's to get them to register?
Registered to vote. I've done a sign up form on the website, which will send you reminders for registration, for proxy vote, for postal vote, and for actual voting. So I'm hoping that it will have, knock-on effects of getting people to the polls as well.
Because that's the problem. It's getting them to go in the first place, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I understand it. So many young people, I think, feel really disillusioned and disenfranchised and not represented by the major parties.
But getting them to the polls.
Yes.
Because that's the day of it. And I guess it goes right back to the beginning when we were talking about perhaps having apathy toward this election. How do you get them out of bed on polling day to go and, even if it's to spoil the ballot, because that's an option.
Absolutely, that's an option. I think if you are mad enough at the system that you're not going to vote, you should be mad enough to go there and tell them you're not participating. With a spoiled ballot, sure, do it. I support that. Because
they are counted. The spoiled ballots are counted.
Yeah.
There's a little line afterwards.
Yeah.
Something that I've been hearing a lot about is, obviously this is our first general election with the new voter ID in effect. And I know a lot of particularly trans and non-binary people who are quite concerned because their ID may not match. And so there's been a lot of concern within the queer community that this new law is going to actually make it much harder for certain minorities to vote in particular. Is that something that you share a concern about?
Yeah, presumably that's why they've done it, right? I'm not going to have the statistic to mind, but the number of problems that the number of people who were turned away at the most recent election because of ID was so high, and the number of people actually turning up prior to that to vote on behalf of someone else illegally was so minor. It's just like, again, it's another problem that didn't need fixing. But they know that the Conservatives know that this is going to impact communities who weren't going to vote for them. So that's why they've done it.
When you saw that Boris Johnson forgot his ID when he turned up to the polling station, how did that make you feel, knowing that there are barriers to entry for some people in the country, and then the person who has, pioneered this policy and actually has access to, let me just think how old he is, several forms of ID.
Yes.
Because he can even use the bus pass.
Oh, I didn't realise that's what you were getting at, but yeah. Well, I'm not sure he's taking buses, but... But
does that frustrate you, knowing that someone who has access to the ID?
I just think it shows what a barrier this policy is. It shows that it's preventing people from voting, and it's not encouraging a more democratic system. It's actually discouraging it. Simple as that. We're also selling Vote Babe stickers at cost, so people can do guerrilla marketing.
I saw this. So when you say it costs, break that down, because I think some people might not understand. So effectively, you're
it's just a non-profit
initiative.
Yeah, it's paying for the printing and the shipping and for someone to send it.
So that's like so this is how people can get involved in it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, if you want to get involved in the Vote Babes campaign, we're selling these sticker sheets. You can buy a sheet of stickers and plaster them on bus stops or urinals or wherever you think appropriate. And it's not a profit-making exercise. We're just selling them at cost. So, I'd love if people got involved.
And where do they go? Where do they go to get them?
Just votebabes.com.
ChatGPT.
I go to ChatGPT, type in, where do I get drag queen voting merch? And hopefully it'll send you to the right place.
You know, I can't work that.
I mean,
I actually can't work it. I've tried so many times.
I've actually used, let me know.
Do you use it regularly?
No, but it's pretty good for, I don't know if I should say this on camera. It's really good if you just want to do like a cover letter and just shove your CV in. Just as someone that had to apply for jobs fairly recently.
Okay.
Great tip.
it's not bad for a press release either.
I believe that.
I love that we hired him off the back of that.
Oh, I didn't do a cover letter for here, baby. Don't worry. No, but can I ask? Could I ask you? Some of the people you've got involved are some of the most like iconic names in UK drag. You've got Keith Scott Claus, Ella Day, River Medway, Davina De Campo, who we love, and also
came in screaming about the Tories.
Yeah.
I believe that. But
Anything to get those fuckers out.
But you've also got some really great non-drag race people. You've got like Frida Slaves
Yes.
and some others. What was their reaction when you phoned them to ask them to be a part, especially so short notice?
Everyone was really, really up for it. You know, I asked people, I tend to be friends with people who are politically engaged. So the people who weren't on Drag Race are mostly my friends. I kind of knew that this was something that they'd be interested in taking part in. So they were really happy to. It was, honestly, it just blew my mind how many people were able and willing to do it. It helped that it was a Monday and a Tuesday, notoriously slow days for drag. So I was able to kind of beg and steal a few people. But, you know, Davina traveled down from the north for it. Yeah, really nice.
Gosh, she really doesn't like the Tories.
Yeah, exactly.
Take one quick look at her Instagram and you'll know that.
Oh, but another barrier to entry, because if they'd actually finished HS2 and they'd let it go all the way up north, she could have been down here quicker.
Tell Davina that. Quick, let's get her on the line, Davina.
Cool.
Fab.
Yeah?
Happy?
Yeah.
Everyone happy?
Happy.
Love it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Really
taking the
fun.
time.